Donald Trump is threatening countries like Mexico, Canada, and China that these countries should do something about the large influx of illegal immigrants, particularly with respect to Mexico. Donald Trump says that if this illegal immigration into America of the Mexicans is not addressed by the government, America would be imposing tariffs. Against China, he says that the import of illicit drugs and illegal drugs reaching US should be stopped by China. Otherwise, China will be subjected to tariffs. Against India, Donald Trump says that India is buying cheap oil from Russia and therefore India is being subjected to additional 25% tariffs. So Donald Trump is using these tariffs to make other demands and to extract favorable policies and decisions from other countries. That's how he's been using these tariffs. And this tariff regime that Donald Trump had therefore put in place, according to him, is going to make America great again. According to him, is going to make other countries respect America. According to him, these tariffs are actually going to realize American interests in a much more efficient way, which America had considered for all these decades to sustain good relations with other countries. But now, the America First policy, make America great again, all these slogans are being invoked to justify the tariff policy which Donald Trump is imposing on those countries. As I told you, these additional tariffs that Donald Trump had imposed on various countries had helped realize a better revenue. Around $28 billion, please excuse me, around $28 billion were expected to be realized in 2025. This represents 3 times higher revenue for the US government compared to 2024. However, one thing that we have to remember here is that the imposition of tariffs had its impact. It led to a slight slowdown of US economy as well. Therefore, everything is not as rosy as is being painted by Donald Trump. There was crash of stock exchange, higher incidence of inflation in US, slowdown of economy in US. All these are things which are being conveniently ignored by the regime in US to support tariffs. However, as we discussed a few minutes earlier, the tariffs that were being imposed by America on other countries were subjected to a lot of criticism domestically as well. For instance, these tariffs were considered as arbitrary, and even the American Supreme Court had mentioned about the arbitrariness of these tariffs. Please remember that whatever were the earlier tariffs that were introduced, as we discussed a few minutes earlier, like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and so forth, these were actually passed and approved by the American Parliament. After they were approved by the American Parliament, the executive went ahead to implement these tariff policies. However, Donald Trump, without a congressional approval, without a parliamentary approval, invoked a law called International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was made in 1977. International Emergency Economic Powers Act, made in 1977, was the law that was invoked by Donald Trump to impose these tariffs. Now, this law says that if there is any economic practice which is detrimental to American interest and which could have an immediate impact of infusing instability in American economic system, then tariffs can be imposed by the American president. This is considered to be an extraordinary measure which also bypasses the established procedure. Normal established procedure is that any tariff should be first approved or endorsed by the parliament. This congressional approval is a precondition for a tariff. But here, the special law 2025, a US appeals court ruled that most of the tariffs which are being imposed by Donald Trump were illegal. However, the court did not go to the extent of directing the executive to stop with these tariffs. He just mentioned that some of the tariffs were illegal. However, the matter was referred to Supreme Court and the matter is still pending in the Supreme Court. Therefore, the legal aspects of the tariffs that were imposed by Donald Trump are also up for discussion in the US itself, with several courts finding them objectionable and illegal. That's one reason why the tariffs were criticized as arbitrarily being used tools. Secondly, there is also a domestic criticism on tariffs that these tariffs are short-sighted. It means that America is only looking at a short-term gain while completely ignoring a long-term potential loss that America may have faced, that America may have to face. The short-term gain in the form of increased revenue could in no way balance the potential or probable loss of American financial hegemony, loss of American deep trade relations that it has with various regions, the animosities and trade wars that these tariffs can bring about, a potential loss of image that America has, and leverage that America could use in future. All these are potential long-term disadvantages of the tariffs which are being imposed by US. Now they were ignored, and therefore the tariffs were considered as a short-sighted approach on the part of the American government. Thirdly, there is a lot of ad hocism in the way the tariffs are being implemented. Many tariffs have been amended, and some of them were delayed after they were announced. The deadline date was extended repeatedly for some countries and for some goods by the American government. Now that shows that there is a lot of ad hocism in the way the tariff policy was handled by the American government. And fourthly, we had witnessed price rises for some products, particularly the products which are required by American industry, which led to a backlash from several industrial groups against tariffs, as these tariffs were hurting their business interests. Also, tariffs led to higher US inflation. I told you a few minutes earlier that the high prices of imports pertaining to some products which do not have efficient substitutes from the domestic economy or domestic market have experienced inflation. It is said that the inflation of certain essentials was anywhere between 1.8 to 2% in US following the imposition of these tariffs. And many firms have warned that they will pass on the cost of tariff to customers. Obviously, that would be one of the reasons as to why there would be inflation. Tariffs, the price of tariffs that the companies will have to pay will be passed on to the shoulders of the consumers or the other business organizations which make these imports, which will obviously lead to inflationary trends in the economy. Also, cost of goods manufactured in US using import components also has increased. As I told you that there are a lot of goods in US which are being produced having a lot of import content, and these in fact are going to be affected, and these goods are going to be much more costlier than the earlier ones. And that's the reason why these tariffs were criticized in a very big way. Now, you know that the tariffs that were imposed by the American president have had a lot of impact globally as well. Not only in American economy, even at the global level also, there were a lot of impacts on the tariffs imposed. For example, it is argued that the imposition of tariffs by Donald Trump has thrown global economy into turmoil. How? Because it led to reciprocatory or retaliatory tariffs from some countries, triggering a trade war. It also led to disruption in supply chains. It also led to diversion of trade flows from one region to another region. All these have disrupted the global trade and have thrown global trade into turmoil. Okay, America, which for so many decades had been acting as a bastion of liberal international economic order, which makes the trade basis for strengthening relations. Please remember, the entire edifice of international economic system was dependent primarily on smooth and peaceful trade relations between countries. And institutions were created for that purpose. For example, the World Bank was created to strengthen social and economic infrastructure in the countries so that trade can be smooth and seamless. International Monetary Fund was created as a mechanism to help countries overcome their balance of payments crisis so that the trade remains uninterrupted. All these are institutions that were created to ensure that the trade is smooth. But this policy adopted by Donald Trump had actually disrupted the process of trade. And secondly, the imposition of these trade tariffs had affected the financial markets. It led to slump. It led to fall of the stock markets. For example, it was observed by John Mearsheimer, a very prominent realist theoretician of US, that the imposition of trade tariffs has led to crash of Dow Jones to an extent of approximately $2 trillion in just one trading session. That's drastic. This is considered to be very highly detrimental to trade practices. So this is the kind of impact that tariffs have begun to show. And we all know that in spite of the fact that the financial markets have largely recouped and have largely recovered, the overall picture continues to remain volatile. And tariffs are therefore having a negative effect because these tariffs begin to affect investor confidence. The uncertainty infused through these frequent tariffs can in fact put a lot of doubts in investors' minds. All this is going to lead to volatility of financial markets. Secondly, the imposition of these tariffs has also, according to the International Monetary Fund, led to a slowdown of international economy as well. For example, the forecast of global growth of IMS, of International Monetary Fund, for 2025 was expected to be 3.2%. And for the financial year 2026-27, the growth rate forecasted by International Monetary Fund is expected to be 3.1%. Both these are below the forecast made by IMF, which was 3.3% prior to the tariff era. Okay? It means that the forecast of global growth shows a negative trend, a falling trend. And only one thing can be attributed to this trend, and that is the imposition of tariffs, which have disrupted global trade and global supply chains, and which had redirected the trade flows and so forth. Also, you know that these tariffs, which have affected the economic interests of several countries, have triggered reciprocal tariffs. For example, countries like China, Mexico, Canada, India had reacted very strongly against the tariffs which are being imposed against it. That had led to trade wars, and that had led to, reinforcing the process of what was called as de-globalization. Countries began to adopt more and more protectionist measures. Countries began to put tariffs. Countries began to give primacy to their domestic markets. And the rules of trade engagements between countries, according to the dictates of the World Trade Organization, continue to be undermined because of this process. It has reinforced the process of de-globalization. Also, these obstacles created to trade practices can sometimes lead to conflicts and irreversible damage, which can have potential impact for global economic growth and global connectivity. The concept of mutual complex interdependence, which is the very basis for globalization, could be undermined because of these unilateral tariffs imposed by US. This is how tariffs and trade wars continue to impact the present international economic system. Thank you so much.